Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to the EPA for inviting NPWS to speak at your conference on the new and shiny regulation, nature restoration regulation. And so I'm going to focus in on what does that mean for water, but in a broader context, I guess. So just in terms of what I'm going to talk about, as I say, the context, I'm going to really just hit the ground in spots here. 20 minutes doesn't really give the enough time to talk through the ins and outs of the entire regulation. I'm also then going to concentrate on two articles that relate to water and setting targets for water, Article 4 and Article 9. A quick look at the cross-cutting elements with relation to other articles and target setting. Look at the requirements of the National Restoration Plan under the regulation, and then some concluding remarks. So just to say, I'm with the Scientific Advice and Research Directorate of NPWS. We have a small team working on the nature restoration regulation, and we are sort of coordinating the regulation and the completion of the National Restoration Plan, but it's an all-of-government approach. So let's move straight on then to the context. So the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 sets out the sort of high-level objectives for reversing biodiversity loss, so reversing it or stopping the trends by 2030, and then the very big target so that by 2050 all of the ecosystems within the EU are restored and resilient and adequately protected. So no pressure there. And one of the commitments under that biodiversity strategy was to put forward legally binding targets for nature restoration in the EU. And this regulation actually sets that out and aims to fulfill that commitment. So the regulation, the draft regulation, was published in June 2022 by the Commission, and it took about 2 years to get through negotiations in the Council, the Parliament, and the trilogue between the three, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. It squeaked through the final vote in the Council in June 2024, and it came into force in August 2024. And because it's a regulation, it's important to note that this piece of legislation came into force at the same time throughout the EU in the wording that is in the published document. So it's unlike a directive where there is transposing legislation by each member state. What you see is what you get in this regulation. And as I say, it's now in force, so there are obligations already that we should be complying with. So just to then go quickly through the structure of the regulation. So it's in 6 chapters. There are 28 articles within those chapters. Chapter 2 is the big one because that's the chapter that sets out the restoration targets and obligations. Chapter 3 then relates to the compilation of a national restoration plan, and those are the 2 chapters that I will be really talking about today, but there are surrounding articles about monitoring and reporting, delegated acts, and final provisions. So also there are 7 annexes to the regulation that they contain the list of habitats and species that are in scope and some indicators associated with specific articles. And finally, there's a large number, there's 91 recital paragraphs that precede the legal text, and they're very important for setting the context and how the regulation should be interpreted, which of course each member state is still grappling with the actual meaning of and the intent of the specific wording of each article. So in terms of the legally binding targets, I should say, no one's really mentioned the marine yet. We're not just talking about the land area of Ireland, we're talking about the transitional waters, and we're talking about this very large marine area. So that is what is in scope. This is where we have to set legally binding targets across the entire landmass and marine waters of Ireland. So just to keep that in mind. So just to move then on to the legally binding targets, They are set out within 8 articles of the regulation, and 4 of those really relate to existing legislation. So this is legislation that we've talked about already today, namely the Water Framework Directive, but also the Habitats and Birds Directives, so that's really what the MPWS focuses on, but also the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So basically what the regulation does, it sets legally binding targets for elements of those existing legislation. It doesn't override them, it just focuses the mind, I guess, within those articles. So if we have a quick look then at some of the water-related elements of these, so I'm going to focus in on Article 4, which is the restoration of terrestrial, coastal and freshwater ecosystems, and those relate to the habitats and species listed in the Habitats and Birds Directive. In relation to habitats, so that's habitats listed in Annex 1 of the Habitats Directive, we report on 59 habitats in total, and over 3/4 of those are water-dependent habitats. So they include transitional waters, such as estuaries and lagoons. There's a series of lake habitats that are listed in Annex 1. It includes turlocks, fens, several bog types. Also includes some habitats like dune slacks, salt marshes, alluvial woodlands. So there's a whole suite of habitats across, most of Ireland, really. And we're not just concentrating in on habitats that are in designated areas. We're not just talking about Natura 2000. We're talking about the entire national resource of these habitats. And of course, these aren't all surface waters. We're talking about groundwaters. We're talking about catchment-related issues when we're looking at restoring these habitats. So we're not just focusing in on water quality, we're focusing in on lots of other issues regarding water, like sediment, like flow, hydromorphology, which was mentioned earlier. So these are all in scope. Any of these habitats that are not good in favourable status, those are in scope for the Nature Restoration Regulation. And how do the targets then fit? So for habitats, they are area-based targets, and they are based on having measures in place. So in recognition that you can't restore habitats quickly, the time-bound targets relate to having measures in place in areas of these habitats that are in not good condition, and they're related, then they have time-bound targets. So in relation to 2030, we have to have effective measures in place in at least 30% of the total areas of those habitat types. We have to have measures in place by 2030. And that then increases to 60% by 2040 and 90% by 2050. And as I say, emphasize that's across the national resource, not just in Natura 2000 areas. The second element relates to putting in measures necessary to re-establish habitat types that are not, if their favourable reference area is below that, as it should be, then we have to put in similar time-bound measures. At least 30% of additional surface needed to reach the total favourable reference area by 2030, 60% by 2040, and 100% by 2050. Those are slightly more nuanced in the regulation, because the targets relate to habitat groups rather than individual habitats, but ultimately we have to look at the suite of habitats, and then look at what measures we need to put in place. And just to say then, also there are provisions in the regulation that say that we can have no deterioration of habitat condition. So if we restore areas, there can be no deterioration, but also there can be no deterioration in habitats that are currently unfavourable. They cannot slide any further down the unfavourable route into maybe bad status. The regulation says that we should concentrate on Natura 2000 areas until 2030, if that's appropriate. In relation to species then, the targets aren't time-bound as such, but we need to put in the measures that are necessary to improve the quality and quantity of the habitats of species, including by re-establishing them and to enhance connectivity until sufficient quality and quantity of those habitats is achieved. And the species, again, are those species listed in all of the annexes of the Habitats Directive, so that's Annex 2, Annex 4, and Annex 5, and also all wild bird species, because they come into scope of the Birds Directive. So species such as water-dependent species, such as freshwater pearl mussel, white-clawed crayfish, natterjack toad, Nias flexilis are listed there, then birds such as wintering water birds and breeding seabirds and other breeding water birds. So any species that we categorize as being in unfavorable status, they come into scope, and measures relating to their habitats have to be put in place. So how do we actually go about quantifying these targets? Well, the main source for the Habitats Directive species is the Article 17 reporting that we do every 6 years. So this is national reporting that defines whether a habitat is in unfavorable, favorable, or bad status, conservation status. And so we last reported in 2019, and we are now due to report this year in July. So taking the 2019 results there, the box shows the 2019 overall status and trends for a suite of species there, and any species there that is in red is basically in bad status, orange is unfavorable, and green is favorable. So you can see in that extract from the report, only one species there was in favorable condition. So really, basically, and all of our water-dependent habitats are either unfavorable or bad status. So we have a fairly big mountain to climb there. And I guess it's important to consider here that good and high water framework directive status is not always enough for some of these habitats and species. So if we take freshwater pearl mussel, we have to go beyond high status to actually turn the trend on that species. In terms of bird species, we report under the Birds Directive under Article 12. Again, the reporting cycle is up this year. We don't have quite the same system, but we report out on status and trends of all bird species, so we have to decide on what species are going to come into scope for the nature restoration regulation targets. So then we have these area-based targets, and these sort of we have some scope to prioritize, but the overall requirement of Article 4, these are the last paragraphs lifted directly from the regulation. We shall ensure that, so there's no option there, shall ensure an increase in the area of good condition for habitat types listed in Annex 1. So that's habitats listed in the Habitats Directive until at least 90% is in good condition, and until the favourable reference area is reached. And then for species, an increasing trend towards sufficient quality and quantity of habitats. So, I mean, however we decide to implement measures, however we decide to prioritize, this is the overall requirement of Article 4. So moving then on to Article 9, which is the article which is firmly linked to the Water Framework Directive, because it relates to the restoration of natural connectivity of rivers. And the requirements there are to make an inventory of artificial barriers to the connectivity of rivers or surface waters, to remove the artificial barriers identified in the inventory that contribute to meeting the restoration targets set out under Article 4, so that would be species such as salmon and lamprey, and then also we need to complement that, the barrier removal, with measures to improve the natural functions of the floodplains. And finally, we need to ensure that those natural connectivities are maintained. So again, no deterioration. And you can see that there is an objective there of the EU to restore 25,000 kilometres of free-flowing rivers across the EU by 2030. That hasn't been split up by pro rata by member states, so we're not quite sure how the Commission are actually going to assess that. So just the Commission have defined free-flowing rivers, so it relates to longitudinal, lateral and vertical connectivity, so we have to keep that in mind. so that's how we're going to have to measure our contribution towards the free-flowing rivers target. In terms of the national barriers inventory, this is being talked about later in the conference, so I don't want to steal IFI's thunder, but we are ahead of the curve in terms of national barrier inventory because the IFI have already developed that along with a tool for displaying it. There's a screenshot there. So you can see 33,000 structures identified and a whole program in place to look at removing them and prioritizing them. So as I say, I don't want to go into that in too much detail, but it does fill a lot of the requirements of Article 9, but we do need to do more work in relation to linking the barrier removal program back to Article 4 and look at the natural functions of related floodplains. Of course, the barrier removal and mitigation program was drawn up before the regulation came on the scene. So then just to look at cross-cutting and complementary targets relating to water in other articles. So I've talked about Article 4. Article 5 relates to the restoration of marine ecosystems, and as we've heard earlier, the activities on land affect the marine and coastal ecosystems, so there's a cross-cutting element there. It's the Marine Strategy Framework Directive that's really focusing in on Article 5, as well as the marine elements of the Habitats Directive. And then, of course, there's species that cross marine birds, use both terrestrial and marine habitats. Article 8 relates to restoration of urban ecosystems, and their targets look at tree cover, urban tree cover, and urban green space. So there's a crossover there between certain wetland habitats. Article 9 I've talked about. Article 11 relates to the restoration of agricultural ecosystems. One of the indicators there is high diversity landscape features, so that might include ponds and on-farm features, but also there is a target relating to the restoration of drained organic soils and re-wetting those soils. And we will be, there's a provision in the regulation that we can use peatlands drained for peat extraction in fulfilling that target, and that's where the link to the EDRIS and PICAS scheme that was just presented to us earlier. And finally, restoration of forest ecosystems includes the entire forest estate, so that also includes wet woodlands in there. So there's a crosswalk there. So there's cross-cutting articles, cross-cutting targets. So it all gets quite complicated. I'll just talk very quickly then about the National Restoration Plan, which we have to compile as part of the regulation. So the restoration plan has a standardized format. It now has been set out. It is a standard format across all member states. It'll be an online reporting format that we will have to complete by September 2026. The first draft has to go into the Commission by then. I said before, this is an all-in-government approach. We're coordinating it in the MPWS, but we have several interdepartmental working groups, and which involve, as I say, state agencies also, and we're working our way through the requirements of the plan. So we have article leads, and we meet regularly, and there's ongoing collaboration between departments and agencies. There's a statutory stakeholder involvement piece written in to the regulation, and that will be ongoing. It started with First Leaders Forum last month, and that will be an ongoing process throughout the development of the plan. The plan is overseen by an independent advisory committee that is chaired by Evie Hulavoen, and as I said, the draft NRP needs to be sent to the EU by December 2026. Quickly, it sets out the national context, sets out the targets and measures required to achieve them. We have to map the areas where measures will be established, and then some for 2030, overviews for 2040 and 2050, and also the monitoring regimes required. My last slide then, some concluding thoughts. I could almost overlap these with what Colin said earlier, because basically we have to have an accelerated and concentrated approach to setting out how we're going to approve habitats and species relevance to Article 4 in order to meet the targets and these legally binding targets. Increased and coordinated effort. So the immediate challenges for us relate to preparing the plan, including data gathering, target setting, prioritization, identifying gaps and overlaps. But the biggest challenge, as we've already talked about, is actually putting in the programs in place, effective and adequate to achieve the targets, including linking up with ongoing and forthcoming plans and programs in other sectors. And finally, though, the internal optimism in me says it also provides huge opportunities for us to take real progress towards restoring nature, making use of the Climate and Nature Fund, and tying in, say, with the next Water Action Plan. Thanks very much.